Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on what time you're watching this class. We are still on the founding of South Carolina, and we're on Social Studies Standard 8-1.6 that talks about the government and the colonies. So we have a picture here of South Carolina, and we know that most of the population lived down in the Low Country, which is down towards the Hilton Head, Port Royal Sound, Edisto, Seabrook, Ashley Cooper Rivers, Fort Sumter, the Charleston area is where those people live. And the population started to shift toward the backcountry, which is every place else, after they opened up townships in the backcountry. So we're going to learn all about that today. But first, let's go over the standard. The standard says compare the development of representative government in South Carolina to representative government in other colonial regions, including the proprietary regime, or the time period in which the proprietors ruled, and the period of royal government and South Carolina's Regulator Movement. We're going to skip the essential questions for now, but you can look at those if you'd like. Okay, up first, the government. So in order to attract more settlers, the proprietors began to share some of the political control of the colonies with the property owners. So if you owned property back then you had a right to have some say in the political climate of the colony as well as in the government. So Carolina developed a political elite. The elite means you're like on top. So you're on the top of that ladder that we saw in that old video talking about South Carolina. The elite as a result of amassing a great wealth and political power in the hands of the largest plantation owners. So those plantation owners down in the Low Country got a lot of political power because they had a lot of wealth, because they had big plantations that were growing those cash crops, rice, indigo, etc., and selling those to not only the mother country, but again, remember, South Carolina was allowed to sell their rice to any country. All right, so South Carolina had a legislative assembly that was established to make laws, including tax laws for the colonies. And most English colonies had a bicameral or a two-house assembly there in their colony. Okay, so this is what the government was like. So you had landowners, large property owners that were in charge of the government. They made laws, and most places had a bicameral or two-house assembly. Okay, so more about government. In Carolina, the proprietors and the elite, or those rich people in the Low Country, had greater representation in the government than did the common people. So you had everyday people, people that didn't have the money or the slaves or the land that lived in Carolina colony. But those people that were in the Low Country that were considered elites or on top had more representation in the government. So South Carolina had a Grand Council, and the Grand Council decided that a majority of each group in the colonies, the representatives of the proprietors, the colonial elite, and the common people, should have an equal voice in the government, even though this representation would not be proportional to their numbers in the population. So no, you wouldn't have 1-to-1 for every person that was in the colony. There was not one person in government, but they did feel like that they needed to be represented in government. So what they did was they created a thing called the Commons House of Assembly. It was a separate house that was established to represent the people. Again, here we see the not invention, but the adoption of more of a democratic way of governing the colony. So you have representation of the people by the people in the Commons House of Assembly. Sounds like democracy to me, right? All right, so again, in South Carolina, the Commons House of Assembly was established to represent the common people, not just the rich and not just the proprietors who actually owned the land, but to represent the common person that was there in South Carolina. Up next, more about government. In South Carolina, representation for the Low Country continued to be greater than that in the backcountry. So if you lived like past, let's just say, if you lived past Jasper County coming up towards Allendale and then up towards Hampton County and whatnot, you really didn't have a say. If you lived in Orangeburg, you didn't have that much of a say in government. If you lived up in the Aiken in the old 96 area, up towards Columbia, that area, Spartanburg and Greenville, you didn't have a say in government, not as much as the Low Country, because remember, most of the rich people lived in the Low Country. Most of those large plantations that we still see remnants of today are located in the Low Country. So there was a lot of tension between the colonists and the proprietors grew. The tension between the colonists and the proprietors grew because the colonists felt neglected because their landlords were not there. So they paid rent or that quit rent to those proprietors, but then they didn't get very much protection from them. One example of that was when the Yamasee War happened. The colonists did not get help from the proprietors during that war. They had to wait for people from Massachusetts and up north to actually send them weapons to be able to fight the Yamasee tribes there. So they felt neglected. They felt like they paid their taxes, but they were not getting any protection. So you know what? They felt like we need to get rid of these proprietors. So the proprietors, on the other hand, thought that the colonists were disobedient and that they were making little profit off of them. I don't see how that's possible, but that's how the proprietors felt. So what happened? In 1719, South Carolina became a royal colony. So the council protested to the king about the neglect of the proprietors and appealed to the king to make Carolina a royal colony. South Carolina asked to become a royal colony. So this was a revolution that was like a revolution without one shot being fired. It happened in 1719. And again, when South Carolina was founded, it was a proprietary colony or owned by 8 men. Eventually in 1719, because of the neglect that they felt like was going on, they protested and asked the king to take the colony over. So South Carolina became a royal colony. The king appointed the governor. And then Carolina split from North Carolina and South Carolina. So at one point it was all one. After this revolution, the silent revolution of 1719, they split into North and South Carolina. Okay, the power of the South Carolina royal governor was limited because the colonial assemblies controlled the taxes that paid the governor's salary. So he couldn't do anything that would upset the colonial assembly because they wouldn't give him the tax money. Now, as you can see here, there's a chart on the left-hand side that talks about what the royal government looked like. So at the top, you have royal government, a royal governor. He's appointed by the king. He oversaw the trade. He approved all laws made by the legislature. So the legislature made the laws and he had to approve them. He could convene or dismiss the Commons House of Assembly. So down a little bit further in this chart, you see the royal council or the upper house. Much like a Senate today, they were appointed by the British government in London, and they advised the royal governor, and they served as the colonial court. Then in the lower house, which is the Commons House of Assembly, more like a House of Representatives, they were elected by qualified voters in the colony. They controlled the colony's finances by making tax laws and paying the governor's salary. And they also made other necessary laws and policies for the colony. So the royal government was a little bit different from what the proprietors set up, okay? All right, so let's go on a little bit further talking about this government. So in the royal colony, economic advantages as a result of becoming a royal colony took place. So the English government increased the subsidies. So that money that they would pay you for growing things, they increased that for naval stores and allowed merchants to sell rice directly to foreign countries. So again, South Carolina got rich, or South Carolinians got rich because they were given money to grow the naval stores or to harvest naval stores. And they were also allowed to sell rice to any foreign country directly. So they didn't have to follow the mercantilistic ideals that we see from this time period where you only sell to the mother country. South Carolinians were allowed to sell rice directly to France if they wanted to. All right. The English government, through the royal governor, established townships in the backcountry to increase migration. So they wanted people to move away from the coast and move back further into the woods, basically is what you would call it, of South Carolina, kind of back here where we are, where we live today. All right, so settlers moved there to establish subsistence farms. So you had a lot of subsistence farmers that lived in the backcountry. The first white settlers to move to the backcountry were traders and woodsmen, so they were viewed by the low country elite or the rich people as uncivilized. So you have the rich people that live in those big plantation homes, and then you had those folks in the backcountry that had their small homes and their small farms, and they had a cow maybe, not slaves and whatnot like you saw down in the low country on the plantations. All right, so representation in government. So the low country along the Atlantic coast surrounding the city of Charleston was the home of plantation owners who grew rich from the exports of rice and indigo. Um, as a as more coastal settlers moved inland and immigrants such as the Scotch, Irish, and Germans traveled along the backcountry valleys from Pennsylvania, the backcountry's white population grew to outnumber that of the low country. So as more people moved into South Carolina, you had Germans, you had Scots, and actually Orangeburg is named after William of Orange, who's a German prince who married an English princess, and that was the Glorious Revolution that happened not too far from this date that we're actually talking about right now. But yeah, William of Orange is who Orangeburg is named after. So that's a German prince. So that's a German town. All right. Those people started moving in the back country, and a lot of people moved there. So there were more people in the back country, or I should say white settlers in the back country, than there were in the low country. All right, so even with the population increase, the back country still had less representation in the assembly. Now, what we're used to today is the representation is based on the population, but back then that was not the case. Okay, so if you lived in the back country, you probably were not represented down in government in Charleston, which was the capital at the time. Okay, this became a problem. So the regulator movement happened. So this basically was a bit of a tension between the back country and the low country. And if we go back to this map, you can kind of see that the back country is everywhere else. The low country was down towards the islands and those areas that are close to the coast. All right, so those two areas, one was densely populated, meaning there were a lot of people in a small area, and then there was the back country that was populated, had more people, but they weren't as closely connected as those people in the low country. So they paid their taxes. Although they paid taxes, the backcountry people got little in return for their colonial government. So they were paying taxes, but not getting any representation, not having any say in the laws of the colony. So they had a problem with that. There was no law enforcement. So settlers took the regulation of society in the backcountry into their own hands in what was called the Regulator Movement. So what these people did was they didn't have the sheriff. So if something happened to you back there, you just had to take care of business. So that's not necessarily a good way to be. I kind of think of it like the wild, wild west. So like, you had the sheriff, you might have had a sheriff in town. Or if you had a sheriff, he was in the next city over or whatever. And, it took them a while to get there and whatnot. So they didn't even have sheriffs. They didn't have courts. And any business they had to handle, they would have to travel from the back country all the way down to Charleston to take care of their business. So imagine living in Greenville at the time, or the Greenville Spartanburg area, and having to get on your horse with your buggy and travel down to Charleston without roads. Okay, there were Native American trails that the Native Americans left, but there were no paved roads then. So imagine you having to pay your taxes. You got to go all the way to Charleston. You should be able to have something that's close to you, right? All right, so there were no courts. The regulators operated as vigilantes. So there was vigilante justice basically happening in the backcountry of South Carolina. So if you stole something, they might hang you. Who knows? They didn't have to have a trial by jury because there was no court for them to have it in. You know what I mean? All right, so the regulators provided law and order through self-regulation, and then they turned lawless. So the guilty were hanged or beaten to death without a jury trial. So they didn't have jury trials because they didn't have a courthouse to go to. All right? So being a vigilante justice is kind of like, think about a movie and there's like a bad guy and he's going to decide, I'm going to kill these people because they've done something that I don't like. That's vigilante justice, all right? All right, so eventually the government of South Carolina came to the aid of the backcountry settlers by setting up 7 circuit courthouses around the colony to provide justice, law, and order in the region. So eventually this came to an end where you didn't have to worry about maybe being unlawfully blamed for some crime that you did not commit. So they set up 7 circuit courthouses to maintain the law, order, and justice in that area. Okay? All right, now what you want to do is make sure that you answer the question that follows this on Canvas.